I have published 5 books now, and I have self-edited all of those books. While I do work with professional editors, I also have a thorough process that I like to go through myself before sending it to them to make sure that the book is as good as I can make it before handing it over to a professional. Part of my self-editing process is going through my editing checklist. This is a series of words and phrases that I personally overuse while I write and while I draft, while I'm not really thinking about my prose. I search for all of these words and Command F them and try to delete as many as possible from my manuscript. Some of these words I try to get rid of every single occurrence in the manuscript. Other times I just manage it and try to get through some. I limit myself to a certain number per chapter. And so today I'm going to share with you what this editing checklist is as of right now in March of 2024. I am always adding to this every time I write a new book. If you're looking to create your own editing checklist, hopefully this will give you a place to start. Or it might just be fun to Command F and search through your current project and see how many times you use these words. You will have to tailor your own editing checklist to your own personal writing style. Every single writer has their own quirks, but my goal on this channel is just to share with you things that work for me and resources that personally help me out, in the hopes that maybe they help you out too, or that experimenting with them helps you discover something about yourself as a writer or your process that could be helpful to you. Before we dive into today's video, hello and welcome to my channel if you're new here. My name is Claire Fries, and I'm an award-winning author who makes videos on this channel sharing actionable writing tips that helped me make my own writing better. I'm the author of the paranormal thriller They Stay series. This is a 5-book series about ghosts and teenagers who have to solve a mystery that has to do with the paranormal and ghosts. This book, book 1 of the series, was the grand prize winner at the 2023 Writer's Digest Self-Published Book Awards, so that is very exciting. And if you like Stranger Things and spooky stories and ghost stories and horror that doesn't get too scary, go check them out. I also published my debut novel while I was in high school, so I make a lot of videos on this channel sharing my experience as a teen author, interviewing other teen authors, and generally sharing the process. So subscribe to my channel if any of that sounds interesting to you. I would be so grateful if you could like this video because it really helps me out. And without further ado, let's jump into the content. I have this list pulled up on my computer, which is like down here underneath the screen. So I'm just gonna go through it and I will put the words up on the screen, this screen, happy screen here, while I'm editing it later. The first thing I like to delete as much of as I can in my writing is filtering words. Examples of filtering words are I see, I hear, I smell, I feel. Instead of saying, I see a bird fly into a tree, you can just say, a bird flies into the tree. I see a bird fly into the tree reminds the reader that the protagonist is the one seeing the bird, and it's not as immersive as allowing the reader to be sucked into the story and just see the bird for themselves flying into the tree by saying a bird flies into the tree. In pretty much all instances, filtering words are unnecessary and take your reader out of the story. So I try to delete every single instance of filtering words in my manuscripts. Specifically, I do searches for I see, I hear, I smell, I feel. Also, I can see, I can smell, and I can hear, because those are just as pesky. Second word that I like to delete, just. Just is tricky. I don't delete every single instance of just because I write from first person present tense point of view, and voice is really important in my writing, so I prioritize the writing sounding like a character is saying it, specifically a teenager is narrating it, and just changes the meanings of sentences and changes the emphasis on certain sentences. So I don't get rid of every single instance. I do, however, do a search for it and just edit through and try to make sure it doesn't get out of hand. I have found paragraphs of my own writing where I've used just 8 times in one paragraph and it's just a little too much. My general rule of thumb is I don't want anyone while they're reading my book to ever be like, oh wow, she uses the word just a lot. Like, I don't want them to notice it, I just want it to be natural. So that's why I try to trim it down to a place that it'll just fly under the radar and feel natural without people noticing it and having it jump off the page. Same thing with probably. I use probably so much in my writing. Also in my speech, I say probably all the time. Probably is another one. I found paragraphs where I've used the word probably every other sentence in a paragraph and it's just so distracting. So I get rid of probablys. I don't get rid of all of them, but I get rid of as many as I can. The next one is definitely. Also unnecessary in most cases. Sometimes does change the meaning of the sentence, and if that is the case, then I will put it in. The next one is really. I'm really tired. It's really far away. You can replace I'm really tired with I'm exhausted, or even I'm tired. You don't need the really in a lot of cases. Sometimes I understand you want to emphasize things. I want to emphasize things. I keep a lot of reallys in there, but I try to trim down as much as possible and only keep in the ones that I feel are necessary to the sentence. Same thing with the next one, which is very. Very is pesky because in most cases there is a stronger word that could replace the word, like if you have very in front of it. If you say I'm very tired, you can say I'm exhausted. Or she's very tall, you could just say she's a giraffe. Again, there are some cases I'd keep it in, but you don't want to let it get out of control, and you want to replace every single one that you can find a stronger alternative for with a stronger alternative. Next on the list is only, simply, or merely. Another one that I use all the time. Sometimes it's necessary. Don't let it get out of control. I let it get out of control in my drafting, so that's why I trim it down. The next one is as a joiner. Let me explain what I mean by this. I mean when you have a sentence that has two independent clauses that are tied together by the use of as. For example, I picked up the phone as I walked into the room. I have a tendency to cram as much information as possible into like my dialogue, not even dialogue tags, but I'll say like she says, comma, and then have as she blah, 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 and like put a lot of information about what she's doing and what that speaker is doing into the dialogue while I'm drafting. I try to cut down on this because this is a bad habit. When you look at this sentence, I picked up the phone as I walked into the room, there are a ton of other ways that you can write it. If the phone, first of all, is in the room, you might not have to say, like, I walked into the room. You can just say, I picked up the phone, implying that that person has gone into the room. It's typically lazy writing, and I do this when I'm being lazy, and so I force myself to look at all of these sentences and either break them up into two separate independent clauses or examine what information is actually important here and break it down into its most simple form instead of letting myself drag it on and create mega sentences all knit together by the word as. Next, we have our lovely, cute little friends, our adverbs. Everybody loves a good adverb, right? Like when you pick up a book and every other piece of dialogue has an adverb attached to the dialogue tag. Like, don't we just love that? No, we do not. At least most readers don't. I don't really enjoy that either. And in my drafts, I tend to use some adverbs because I'm just drafting fast and I'm trying to figure out what it is that I want to do with my story and how I want my characters to say certain things. So I go through and I delete all of my adverbs, or I try to replace them with stronger verbs. Not necessarily all my adverbs. I actually made a video on adverbs specifically talking about whether they're always bad or not always bad. So I'll link that in the description below if you want to check that out. My general opinion on adverbs is that an adverb can almost always be replaced by a strong verb. If you say, she said quietly, you can easily replace that with she whispered. Or she said loudly can be replaced with she screamed. And that's always a more compelling way to write it. In some cases, an adverb is the simplest way to get a piece of information across. And if you use few adverbs, that's okay. The occasional adverb is fine. You just don't want to use adverbs all the time because more than likely there's a more interesting way to say it. I only leave an adverb in if trying to come up with a stronger word is going to take readers out of the scene, and if that piece of information is not super important. Like I'll say like she said airily or she said gently or something like that because it's just the most efficient way to get that piece of information across, but I only use it every once in a while. And I use a lot of adverbs when I'm drafting, so I go through and I do an entire Command F for words that end in ly and cut out my adverbs. I also get a lot of the probablys and definitelys when I do this pass. The next thing I like to go through and delete is stage direction. By stage direction, I mean anything that is an unnecessary phrase indicating how somebody is moving through a scene. So things like turn to look at, bent over and, reached out and... You don't need to say, I bent over and picked up the sword. You can just say, I picked up the sword, and people will get the picture. It's a lot of unnecessary padding and fluff for your sentences, and your sentences are always better off when you get rid of the stage direction. On a similar note, I get rid of general redundancies. So I search, especially for this one because I'm bad about this one, he held it in his hand. I always do a in his hand or in her hand search because, you know, I have a bad habit. He held it in his hand can just be he held it. It's not that complicated. Obviously, he's gonna hold something in his hand. This is not something I can search for, but it's something that I like to keep an eye out for when I am self-editing and reading through my manuscript for the last time before sending it out. And that is redundant adjectives. So if I describe someone as being big, hulking, and jacked, like, people get the idea. If the person is big and hulking and jacked, like, people know that he's big and muscular, so I don't really need to use all of those words. If I say, oh, he's jacked, people are gonna understand that he's probably big. Or hulking, I mean, that gets the picture across too. You don't need to say hulking and big. So I like to make sure that my descriptions are as simple as I can make them. I do a search for redundant POV reminders. So things like I think to myself or I remind myself. This is predominantly for people who write in the first person. You don't need an I think to myself after a sentence when you're writing in the first person because literally everything you're writing is happening in that person's head. It's implied. You don't need to say I remind myself or I think to myself. You can just write that person's thoughts. So the next one is another one I can't really search for, but it's something I keep an eye out for, is adjectives that don't really mean anything. If you describe something as beautiful, what does that really mean? If you say, oh, the flower was beautiful, can you picture a beautiful flower? I bet you if you asked every single person who's watching this video to picture a beautiful flower, the picture that you would have in your head would be different. Beautiful doesn't necessarily mean anything in fiction writing when you're describing things. You can say the flower was yellow, you can describe the petals, you can describe the shape of the flower. All of that is better than just saying it's beautiful because it's more specific. There are a bunch of adjectives like this that can sneak their way into our writing. Things like weird, disgusting, surprising, eerie, unsettling, strange, odd. None of those really mean anything, so you're better off replacing that with something more specific. Ideally a specific detail that readers will intrinsically be like, oh, that's a weird thing, or that detail is a little strange, so they can imply that that person is weird without you using the word weird to describe them, because the word weird is not as strong or compelling as a specific weird thing about them that you describe. The next thing I try to delete or keep an eye out for is the times that I use be as a verb, especially in character descriptions or place descriptions. Like in the example of she is taller than me. She is something that already exists. It's not active. Like the verb be in usage of the word like be and exist is not an active verb. So it's not as interesting as choosing an active way to phrase that, like she towers over me. She towers is more active than she is taller than me. Sometimes I'll write he is looking in that direction. I will easily change that to he looks in that direction or he glances in that direction because it's happening now on the page instead of already happening, like it happened before and now we're just describing something that happened before. It's more interesting when things happen on the page. So I'll typically do a word search for he is or she is, but it doesn't always lead me to what I'm looking for, so this is also another thing that I look out for while I'm reading. The next little grouping is all stuff that I do word searches for. So I search for words like some kind of, one of the, what looked like, what seems like, my own. You can get rid of the own, you can just say my. Obviously you need to change the tense of all of these depending on the tense that you're writing in, but you know, you get the picture. And then these next ones are a little bit more personal to bad habits that I personally have as a writer, but I will throw them in here anyway in case you want to take a look. The first one is glance. Like I glance at, he glances at me, she glanced at the floor. I use glance way too much. Everybody is glancing at everything in all of my books, and I am trying to get that under control. It's my go-to for when I'm drafting. I always picture who's looking at what and who's looking at who, and I am very visual in my writing, and my sense that I always describe what they see way more than what they smell and touch and hear. So I always opt for glancing as a description, and I need to get that under control. So I always search for glance. I also search for pulls or pulled. I use that way too much. That's one of my go-tos as well. Last but not least, using but as a sentence starter. I am extremely bad about this. I wasn't paying attention to this when I first wrote They Stay, and when I reread it, it had so many sentence starts that started with the word but, and it became really distracting to me because somebody pointed it out in my critique group when they were reading an excerpt of mine, saying you start a lot of sentences with but, and then I couldn't unsee it and I would see it everywhere. So I limit myself to one per chapter now, and that has been working out a lot better. I just generally use the word but when I'm writing a lot, but I've either tried to divide the sentences with a comma so the sentence isn't starting on the word but, and then there are some times where I do like to start the sentence on the word but I limit it to how many times I'm allowed to do that. So there you have it. That is my editing checklist that I use for when I self-edit my books. This is not a proper substitution for working with a professional editor. I always work with professional editors, multiple professional editors on every single book that I publish, and I highly recommend you doing so. I've worked with developmental editors to develop the concept and the plot. I've worked with line editors to firm up the prose. I always work with a copy editor now, or a copy editor / proofreader, just to make sure that I can keep the number of typos under control. This is something I do before I send it to a line editor to start looking at prose. I do this after I have gotten the plot where I want it to be, after I've worked on with the developmental editor, after I have done all of my revisions on the plot, and now I'm just starting to dig into the prose. This is something that I do there. Another thing I do is I run my entire book through Pro Writing Aid, and that helps me a lot identifying phrases that I overuse, identifying grammatical issues, fixing some typos before even sending it to the proofreader. So I put every single chapter in individually, and I do a thorough deep dive with Pro Writing Aid, and that helps me a lot. If you're curious, this is what Pro Writing Aid looks like. It is a very powerful tool. You can insert your writing in here, and then there are all sorts of different things you could run searches for at the top, like general grammatical issues, style issues, overusage of phrases, if you wanted to rephrase things. This is, I think this is a new thing. I think it might be an AI thing. Repetitions, so if you have repeated words and phrases in your story, they will highlight them for you. Close echoes, if you use the same words very close together in the story, they will tell you that too. Generally, it's very powerful. It's really helpful. I highly recommend. But I do this before working with a professional as something that I can do myself. I hope this video was helpful to you. If it was, please make sure to like it and also subscribe to my channel. As I mentioned at the beginning, my name is Claire Fraze, and I make videos sharing actionable writing tips that personally helped me make my own writing better. Because every writer is different, and what works for me is not necessarily going to work for you, so in order to discover your own personal writing process, you need to explore and try a bunch of things before deciding what you want to incorporate into your own process. Are there any words on here that I missed that you typically search for when you are self-editing your own books? If so, comment down below and let me know what they are. I am always very open to expanding my lists and giving myself more to edit while I am editing. I hope you have a fantastic week, everybody, and as always, happy writing.